the next claim is that since Chinese rule of Tibet, 1.2 million people have died from the Chinese genocide. This claim, Dorothy Stein from the Royal Society of Asian Affairs once noted that this claim of 1.2 million was arrived, quote, purely by Tibetan nationalists. It has never been academically backed or verified or peer-reviewed or etc., etc. There is a large amount of academic studies, etc., basically debunking this. I'll just point out a few. Professor Colin McCarus, in the 2005 report to the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, notes that the 1.2 million figure should be treated, quote, with the deepest skepticism. Based on all available evidence, he concludes the population of Tibet has increased in a historically unprecedented manner since the 1960s, where infant mortality, life expectancy, improved mortality rates all came about as a result of Chinese rule. And this isn't just his conjecture. We can test this now because when China began to occupy Tibet, there were 2 million Tibetans, and now there's 5.4 million living in China. So if the Chinese government were attempting genocide upon Tibet, then they're doing the worst job in the world because they've more than doubled the population. Another study, and this is interesting because it's from Patrick French, who was a former director of Free Tibet in London, so you would not think that there was an ulterior motive here against the Tibetans. After extensive research in Badala Palace in Lhasa, etc., when he was allowed into Tibet in 2008, said that there was no evidence to support the figure of 1.2 million Tibetans killed as a result of Chinese rule. The next myth to be debunked is forced sterilization and infanticide. In terms of, I'm not saying that this is actually an outright myth, because it would not be out of imagination that it happens on a small scale. But the idea that it happens as a large scale, as policy, should be debunked. So, first off, we have historian Tom Grunfeld, who wrote in The Making of Modern Tibet that despite all claims over the decade by the Dalai Lama and various Tibetan independence groups of forced sterilization, they've not managed to produce a single case. A demographical study of Pala, an area located in western Chantang, by Tibetologist Melvin Goldstein, who's one of the most foremost Tibetologists, says that in 1959 to 1990, large families remained the norm and that no reproductive constraints were imposed upon nomadic herders. Just a note here, a lot of you may know that China has a one-child policy. However, this policy is exempt for ethnic minorities, so Tibetans are not subject to the one-child policy. Goldstein goes on to say that despite repeated claims in the West that Chinese had imposed a strict policy of birth control in Tibet, where forced abortions, sterilizations, and infanticides are everyday occurrences, and here she's quoting the New York Times, there was no policy of restricting reproduction in Pala, let alone evidence of forced abortions, sterilizations, or infanticide. In 2002, there was a larger study. Goldstein was also part of it, but there was also Ben Jiao, Cynthia Mbiel, and Futsok Tsering, who claimed that there was no evidence on any of the sites surveyed in Lhasa that was applying a two-child birth rule in rural Tibet. And I find it interesting because the conclusion of the study is that the study highlights the dangers of using refugee reports and anecdotal evidence to interpret highly politicized situations, which is exactly what's happening. There's been no reliable, in my opinion, academic source claiming that there has been physical genocide or there's been forced sterilization or massive infanticide on a mass scale against ethnic Tibetans. But every report to the contrary, which we take at face value in the West, has been generated by anecdotal evidence from either refugee groups or extreme Tibetan nationalists. Now, where would I like to see Tibet? I would like to see it remain a part of China just because, as I said, the Tibetan independence movement actually doesn't have a ground to stand on, and that if I am going to be consistent about my idea of the universality of rights and secularism, then I wouldn't want to see Tibet possibly introduce any elements of theocracy, which it used to be until the PLA occupation, and also any elements of serfdom, more importantly. So, But however, I would like to see an increased liberalization of Tibet. I would like to see a reverse of Han settlers into Tibet. I would like to see their cultural heritage and religious norms, etc., protected, obviously. But this is not a view that's completely alien to the Communist Party. In fact, in the 80s, General Secretary of the Communist Party, Hu Yaobang, and then his successor, General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, implemented these policies exactly. So it's not, as I said, the entire point of this video is that it's not a black and white issue between Black China and White Tibet, or black invasion, white. It's just far more complex, far more nuanced than that, and there's a lot of misconceptions around the issue. This has been the first video log by the Free Manchurian. Das war Daniel.